content warnings. So we have death, blood, pain, and childhood trauma. So, Jack.
That makes it sound very fun and appropriate. Thank you, Joe. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming. First, right off the bat, as I'm kind of almost a little bit obliged to, if you're not already following us on Twitter, it's at right_HU, and on Instagram it's at HullUniRights. If you would please check those out. Jaden, if you could post a TikTok in the chat. I don't quite remember it off the top of my head. My apologies. And tonight I'm bringing you my document one piece because I struggled to find something to write for this showcase, so I just copied it. And Joe and Nikki said I could do that, so yeah. So this is titled Rebirth. Once it was over, the first thing he felt was the warmth that seemed to spread across his back like water in a trench. The boy growled low in his throat as he tried to push himself up off the cold stone table, but the chains which bound him to the floor restricted such movement. He'd been told they were for his own safety, but that phrase meant very little on the inside. Turning his head to the right, he saw the usual pale blue walls, the enchanted ice that kept him and many others trapped inside this sorry excuse of a prison. He could just about make out the reflection of an older man standing to his left, washing his hands in a small basin before turning to look upon his handiwork. "You did well, Lordic." "The operation was a complete success," the older man remarked as he knelt to undo one of the chains. His nimble hands worked quickly, and soon both arms were free, to an extent. A heavy iron manacle was clasped tightly around each wrist, the metal scratched and dented after many frustrated attempts to break them off. The boy remained silent, repeating the motion he'd mentally attempted earlier so that he could sit up properly. His right arm moved steadily over his shoulder and felt for the source of this warmth. To his surprise, he found two. The first was a thick trail of blood that was beginning to trickle down his naked back, some of which now clung to his middle finger as he brought it back in front of his eye. To anyone else that may have been there, the liquid looked no different to how it had been before the operation, but to Lordic and the older man, there was something markedly different about it. The second source of warmth on his back was also the origin of his bleeding, as his hand returned for a secondary exploration. It traced out two markings, one on each shoulder blade. They'd been carved into the skin and muscle by the older man. The instrument of such a task now sat inside the basin behind them. It hadn't hurt. Hurt was too soft a word for what he'd experienced. Bruises hurt. Paper cuts hurt. This had pained him worse than any guard's club or prisoner's blade. He returned his hand to its previous position in front of his face, stared at the red stain that was beginning to trail down his finger, and then shifted his eyes over to the older man who had been waiting patiently for him. "Didn't you hear me? It was a complete success." He nodded once in agreement, the words quick to form but slow to escape. His mind was more occupied with other things now, like how the warmth was spreading around his body. The more he thought about it, the quicker the fire barreled through him. It felt as if his veins were aflame, like he was burning up from the inside, but it didn't seem to bother him much at all. It was a dull heat, like a fever that flares up just before an illness and then recedes into nothingness. It engulfed him entirely, and though he felt as if he would scorch the stone beneath him, it didn't appear as if the older man could see anything extraordinary. "So what now?" Lordic asked, eyes locked on the golden frames of his employer's spectacles. "Now, my boy, now you truly work for me. There's a place you need to go, and an item you must retrieve for me. I'll explain the details later, but right now I feel it's time we flex these new muscles of yours." Lordic smiled as he stood up and staggered over to a dirty mirror in one corner of the room. From the front he appeared no different. It was the same battered body, with scars laid upon the muscle he'd fought for. The same smoke-black hair flopped around in messy strands which threatened to cover his face, and the same mud-brown eyes took all this in as he stood in silence. Raising his hand once again, furious heat now reduced to a gentle warmth, he stared a moment more before snapping his thumb and forefinger together listing a spark followed by a flame which danced atop his finger. He watched it, enthralled by its delicate beauty. It was the first true heat he'd felt in 3 long, cold years. A smile graced his lips as he willed the flame to spread along the finger and engulf the hand entirely. The reaction was instant, and he looked upon this new power with a mind full of potential. He turned back to face the older man, smile intact, and said, "What do you want me to do?"